This is Katie McCrindle. And I met Katie because I think you reached out to me after listening to me on Athena's podcast, The
Mm.
Diet Dropout. And I was so grateful that you reached out because it's so nice to get to know other people in this space, especially people who have done just a different perspective. You landed, I think, in this space in sort of a different way. So why don't we just even start there of yeah, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit and then tell us how you got into this work?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I'm Katie McCrindle. Pronouns are she or they, and I'm a body liberation counselor, which is a self-appointed title,
I love it.
and social worker, registered social worker, um, and a fat activist. I'm kind of keeping all three, and that's kind of how I got into this work through fat activism, which is why I kind of keep that in my title. It's my roots of this work. So, as many people do, was kind of on the diet train for a long time. I've been diagnosed with uh, content warning, a word, obesity from a young age. And so, kind of thought that that was something that was wrong with me. It was my fault. All the things that kind of the medical system tells you. And I found a Tumblr blog called Chubby Bunnies. I don't know if you've heard of it.
No.
Yeah, so it's kind of like, I don't know if it's even active right now. It was like a while back. So this was like 2011, 12 maybe. And that was the first time I kind of stumbled upon something that, showed people in bigger bodies in like a positive light. People are kind of in various stages of undress, and it was kind of just all about gassing other people up, like, oh yeah, you look so hot, you look so beautiful, like, and I'd never seen that before. That was like super impactful for me. I was like, whoa, if these folks can feel this way about their bodies and other people are saying these kinds of things to them, like maybe I can too. And so that was like kind of the first, well, hey, I don't have to hate myself because I'm fat. um, and so that kind of led down a rabbit hole of research, and I found um, fat activism and kind of like the fat acceptance movement and everything around that. Um, and started, I gave up dieting. So that was a long journey until I kind of wanted to do a deeper dive into this stuff. I'd done my BSW, and there was no mention of like size as an oppression, and it was an anti-oppressive degree. So I was kind of in it like there's something missing here. I feel like, you know, size isn't mentioned, and this is weird. And I was just sort of starting to get into fat activism. So I kind of kept that in mind, and then a few years later, when I was ready to do my master's, I did what I joke as a master's of fat activism. It was a master's of social work, really. Um, but I wanted to learn everything I could, and I really submerged myself into it. And while I was in that process, I kind of, I got a lot of support from online communities, but I didn't feel a lot of support in like real life. There weren't really real life communities that I had heard of, anyways, or people that, this was their job to support people with kind of exiting diet culture, and accepting their bodies in whatever size they were. So that's kind of the spark for me that like made me want to get into this work and supporting people in their journey with their bodies and size acceptance. And so I wanted to kind of be that person I wish I had in that journey. And that's kind of how I got here today.
I love it. There's so many things you said that I'm like, yes, like just even just the basics. It seems so basic and yet it's so controversial somehow of just that representation, right? And virtually everyone I've interviewed has said, I never saw me anywhere. And that was my experience growing up. And I was small bodied and I still didn't see my body shape and my type anywhere. And so, yeah, as I got further along in my own journey, I started to think, my God, if it was that hard for me in a small, straight size body, I can't even imagine. Well, I can now, but at the time, like I was completely unaware, which leads me to the next thing you commented on. I was taking notes of just that fat oppression never being talked about. And it's still not generally talked about as we're talking. I did Summer Einenen's body image coaching program recently, and Emma Pound Cake, Danny Adams, I think is her name. She's in Florida. Anyway, she did a whole thing, and we did the Harvard implicit bias tests. And interestingly, as you start reading about that, the only implicit bias that has been getting worse over the last couple decades is fat. All the other ones are improving. So tolerance for, you know, people of color, Black people, trans people, like all the other things, they are improving. Our tolerance is getting better, and fat is getting worse. And it's the one we don't talk about.
Yeah.
Oh,
that is so disappointing to hear for someone who's like in this field. And, you
yeah.
know, people often say, like, you know, it just feels so impossible, right? Like we feel so weighed down,
Yeah.
weighed down by like there's so many puns in this word that I love
It's great. I love it.
But yeah, we really do though. Like we're so, you know, this feels impossible that we're actually having this conversation and like actually getting, you know, the conversation into school so I can learn sooner and all of that kind of stuff. And I'm always thinking, well, I have to believe that things are getting better. Like we're having these conversations, you know. When I was a kid, there's someone like me, there's no way they would have existed. So like that in itself kind of, and someone like you, that they wouldn't have existed either, right? So that in itself is like, I feel like a signal that things are getting better. So I don't know about this. Who takes the Harvard test? Maybe like it's not the same folks I'm talking to, I guess. But
well, it's not. You and I are speaking to people who have sort of looked behind the curtain and gone, oh, am I going to take the plunge, right? Am I going to actually unpack this? Because it's hard work, as you and I know. It's very uncomfortable.
yeah.
There's so much information. There's so much quality research supporting these conversations. And yet it is magnificently hard to find if you don't know what you're looking for and you don't have connections of people who have already done the heavy lifting. There it is.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, like absolutely. I think that's one of the things I hear a lot is like, oh, you know, someone who's been recently diagnosed with diabetes, for example, like wanting to find weight neutral information online. And it's like, the first thing I say is like, don't Google it because it's nearly impossible to find. So I'll send them to like Reagan Chastain, like looking at their Hayes Health Sheets website, or, you know, like reliable sources that I've like checked out, because you're right, like just Googling it, oof, it's rough.
No, it's a very scary world. So let's circle back to your master's in fat oppression because I love that. So what was that like for you? So like you went in to do your master's and you decided, I'm going to talk about this. Full stop. This is it. So what was that like? How was it received? What struggles did you have? How did that go?
Yeah, well, I applied with that intention. So, I mean, clearly the school, I ended up going to McMaster. And clearly the school, they already knew me. That's where I got my bachelor's degree. So they, you know, were comfortable with accepting somebody who wanted to do that research. The actual process of it, I think it was interesting, you know, like choosing a supervisor, for example, talking to a couple of people, mentioning like the word fat, and like kind of getting that like blank sort of stare of like, what, you're saying a word that you shouldn't be saying, you know.
Word.
Right. And
Yeah.
so it's just that like, oh, okay, like this is what it is, and since you like don't already know about it, then maybe we're not the best fit, right? But I actually found an amazing supervisor, Anne Fudge Shoremans, and she specializes in disability, actually. So and she was very much open to this and had already worked with the PhD student who was doing research in fat stuff. So that was like an amazing find. And plus the overlap between disability studies and fat studies is huge. It's they're very related, and it's very useful for like analyzing fat studies to have like a disability analysis. So anyways, that was like really, I was very lucky that she was there and open to that. One of the things that was really strange though was like at the time I had been doing like more fat activism online, um, and using fat online as a word, but actually saying it to real life humans, I had done much less of. Um, so it was that weird moment every time I talked to somebody about my thesis. So it was like, oh, what, because that's inevitably the question you get, right? What are you researching?
Yeah.
So I would be like, oh, I'm looking at, fat folks and their relationships with their bodies. And they'd be like, what folks? Who? What did you say there? Like, oh, fat. Oh, fat. Oh, kind of that, like, what? So either I would get like a week, kind of a, let's not talk about this sort of like change the subject thing, or I would get like a, oh, that's really interesting that you're using that word. Like, tell me more about that, which was really lovely. And then I got to sort of practice like, well, I identify as fat. So this is the group that I'm interested in researching, and like the kind of going down that, explaining like what that means and how it's a reclaimed identity, and it's like a descriptor, and it's like a political stance. There are all these meanings, right? So I became more and more comfortable actually saying that word in relation to myself, in relation to other people, which is kind of a side note, because people are always like, well, should you just call people fat then? And I'm like, well, it kind of depends. Like, do you know that they identify that way? Um, I kind of refer to like fat people, fat folks in like a general way, talking about size oppression or fat oppression. Um, anyway, so like that just became this like interesting process of sort of coming out as fat in a way. And there's actually an article called Coming Out as Fat, and talks about, the sort of the coming out process of kind of comparing like queerness and fatness, and how, you know, it's different to be walking around in a fat body than to actually be coming out as fat and like saying that word, because you're locating yourself in a specific identity. Um, so I was doing that over and over. In every class, I brought it up. I did every paper on it. I talked about it. I was loud about it. And that was huge practice for me, and just like really solidifying my own fat identity.
Yeah.
So it was incredibly valuable in so many different ways, that master's.
No doubt.
Yeah.
It sounds almost like your own personal immersion into, I am fat, I'm going to hold that space, and just having that constant, I don't know, like I do mirror work, right? Of like finding that neutrality in the mirror. And like the more often you get there, it starts to settle in as, okay, that's what I look like. So to own that is very cool, and very hard for a lot of people, right? Because that word fat is so incredibly loaded. Um, yeah, I have many, many stories of where I've put my foot in my mouth and used it when I didn't have permission. And yeah, yeah, offended without meaning to. If it just, me thinking like it's a fat body. You have a fat body. And no, not everybody is in that space where they want to hear it.
Yeah.
But it has become sort of normal for me and in our home. One of the stories I share regularly, my son was in his health class at school. And I'm a small fat on the spectrum of fatness. And one of the girls basically they were talking about health class, right? And the good food and the bad food and the consequences of eating bad food, and one of them is fatness. And so why shouldn't we get fat, I think was the next conversation, or something along those lines. Anyways, one of the girls said, well, fat people can't exercise. My son went, yes, they can. And she was arguing, and his line was, my mom's fat and she exercises all the time, so your mom's wrong. And he was telling me this when he got home, and I was just so proud of him that for him, like, I'm fat and he's skinny, and they're just descriptors, right? My husband's tall, I'm short. They're exactly the same in his mind. And I thought that was really beautiful. He's definitely learning now that he's entering his teen years that fat is a loaded word, and that he needs to be conscientious with it. But man, wouldn't it be cool if it didn't mean all the things that it means to so many people?
Yeah, absolutely. Like that, I mean, there obviously on my side there is that recognition, right? Like, yes, I can reclaim it and I can, use it in a way that's neutral, but it isn't actually seen as neutral in society. And so like the social repercussions are obviously going to be there if someone's like living in a bigger body. And I guess the way I think about it, and a lot of other activists do, is like the more that we use it, the more that we normalize it, and like the more we have those conversations that I'm talking about when someone's like, "Oh, hey, tell me more. Like, what do you mean about that?" And then it becomes like it spreads, it spreads, it spreads. I always tell people that like we're planting seeds constantly,
Yep.
and when we feel like, oh, this is so impossible, it's like, well, you're planting a seed every time you have a conversation about, hey, let's not talk about food is good and bad, or whatever. Try to normalize fatness, whatever the thing is.
Yeah. Oh, it's exciting. It's exciting. It's happening, right? And there are the spaces. And when I first came across the anti-diet approach, it was not fat acceptance. Just to be super clear, I don't call that being part of the conversation. It was definitely about body neutrality, let's say. But fat acceptance was not that was not part of my initial introduction to all of this. And I forgot where I was going with that. Terrible. Um, anyway, oh, what I was going to say is I felt overwhelmingly alone. Like that was pre-internet being what it is today. We didn't have Facebook. We didn't have like there was message boards that were archaic and very difficult to navigate and even find. And there I was in naturopathic college trying to learn about a non-diet approach to things. That was crazy. And I had zero support and conversations to have. And so, yeah, maybe the Harvard says that it's getting worse overall, but there is a solid foundation of people having these conversations, creating these spaces for people to talk about it and to explore it and to find some peace, which is super amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh, so good. I love it. So, in all of this research that you did, because you are way more researched than I am in this side of things, what were some of the like standout things that you remember that were either like incredibly validating or incredibly shocking, or just what were some of those key things that you were like, whoa?
Well, I mean, um, in terms of like what I use in session, I think like the most kind of shocking thing was how diet culture stems from racism and like the transatlantic slave trade. That actually didn't enter like my world until like I think 2019 was when Sabrina Strings published Fearing the Black Body. So I didn't actually encounter that until after my master's was completed,
Mm.
to be honest. But what I would often like rely on in that work was the idea of um, it not being our fault, like the like looking at sort of how they diagnosed like obesity and BMI and how like it's a completely flawed system, and that in itself does have some racist undertones as well. So like, but I think that the sort of not being our fault argument was very useful and is very useful in sort of the beginning stages of this work for people. And there's also like in the fat studies area, there's kind of this like, well, even if it was our fault, like it doesn't matter because we're humans who are deserving of rights and care and respect and dignity and all of the things that we deserve just by being human. So um, I discovered those kind of two arguments floating around in fat acceptance spaces, and the they both were really useful for me at different points in the journey.
Yeah. Yeah. The the racist undertones is still like, I'm still navigating that and learning that and reading those books and starting to understand more of that. And yeah, I think I actually just put a post up recently about it doesn't matter why someone's fat. They're still a human being deserving of being treated with dignity. Um, and that was a big one for me right at the beginning too, was as I sort of untangled myself from the wellness culture diet conversation to go, okay, let's put this healthism thing aside and just, do they deserve to be treated properly and have access to things? And that was like, yeah, that was a big one for me of the, oh, I didn't even realize I wasn't looking at it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I think back to like I used to go to a weight loss clinic, and they kind of, I remember at one point were like, do you even want to lose weight? Like kind of there's this really blaming quality to how they approached me. And I remember that was actually the appointment where I was like, I'm not doing this anymore. Like that's, you can't treat people like that. And so discovering it was not my fault was a huge thing, because I was like, oh, I've been telling myself it's my fault. I'm bad at dieting. Like I'm bad at exercising. I don't have any willpower. Like all of that stuff.
Yeah.
I was telling myself, so that argument of like, oh, it's not my fault. Like it's largely genetics. It's a lot of other different things coming into play was really useful. And then sort of the argument of, yeah, we all deserve basic rights and care was really came with like my social work background of like one of the tenets of social work is like the respect and dignity of all persons. It doesn't matter what they've done, their background, anything like that. Just like being human is means that they deserve rights and dignity and are inherently worthy as people. And so that was like, okay, so we're kind of like made our way through the it's not my fault and it doesn't matter if it's my fault into this like, okay, every human being deserves quality care and resources and all of those things.
Love it.
Which is like a huge thing that I bring into sessions with people, because that like inherent worth of a person, I find that people really struggle with that. Like they'll be like, okay, everyone else is it's okay if they're fat, but me, it's not okay if I'm fat. Like I somehow have to measure up to different standards than everybody else, right?
Yeah.
So I often bring in that piece of like, well, if everyone is inherently worthy, like that includes you, that includes me. Like remember that, like that we're a part of that. And I know that's hard work, and people work at it. I have to, but I think it's so important in that like frame of mind. I don't know about you, but so many people I work with struggle with it, internalized fat phobia. Even if they've kind of done the outside work, it's like the internal piece that's the hardest.
Yeah. How do you turn that around and apply it to yourself? And that, I mean, it means unpacking some really uncomfortable things. And yeah, for me, it was huge just to know that it wasn't my fault. I'd been marinating in this sludge for my entire life. So of course I have these thoughts and these beliefs, and they don't belong to me. And that was huge for me, because again, self-compassion was not something that was um, demonstrated in my world. So that, and most of the people I talk to, that is true also. So yeah, just being able to take a deep breath and go, okay, just because I have these thoughts doesn't mean that I actually believe them to be true. And I can start to look at them without being hard on myself. And again, massive changes from that, right? Slow, massive changes. Because yeah, it is. It's a lot of heavy lifting. Yeah, yeah. Anything else that while you were doing your research, things that really surprised you, or I don't know, that you remember just going, huh?
Well, I'm remembering kind of my results of my research and sort of what did I find by talking to people about their relationships with their bodies. And two things are coming to mind right now, so I guess I'll share those. Like the first one that isn't surprising, but just like absolutely devastating is like the experience of dehumanization
Mm.
that people talked about. So I interviewed 6 people who identified as fat. I think almost all of them, maybe 5 of the 6 were fat activists, or like used that term and reclaimed it. Everyone used that term, but and so that just hearing the stories of feeling like you're not a human, that you're being treated as though you're lesser than someone else simply based on size of your body. And like these things happened in so many different ways. Like they happen like outright somebody saying it, or like, by not having the right size like blood pressure cuff,
Yeah.
or not having a chair you can sit in. Like there's so many, or just kind of like a lot of people talked about the look
Mm.
that people get um, from other people and they're being fat phobic. And yeah, that's like feels dehumanizing, even if, of course, we can't know what everyone's thinking. But we do know that this is a society rife with fat phobia. So there is a chance that is being thought. And so, yeah, like that experience was really hard to hear and sad.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
My patients definitely communicate that experience in a variety of situations. And across the size spectrum, like it gets progressively more overt and aggressive the larger the body becomes, right? The biggest bodied person experiences it in the absolute most. I'm going to use the word traumatizing way because I can't think of any other way to say it. Like it's disgusting the way they get treated. And even it happening in like mid fats and small fats and not being able to, I mean, just a recent thing, I I was at an amusement park and there wasn't weight, like max weights posted anywhere. And I thought, I mean, how do I know that I can go on that ride safely? Like it's not just posted. It's not just shared. There's just the assumption. And that was just one of those moments where I was looking around and thinking that's really disappointing. And then of course the fact that many of those rides would not accommodate people in large or very large bodies. And again, something I'd never really noticed in all my years. And I guess that's probably why I feel so passionate about having these conversations and wanting to keep this conversation going, because I spent my whole life not even realizing that these things were going on in plain sight around me every day. In medicine, going through school, like you said, blood pressure cuffs. It was mentioned that you have to have the right size cuff, but if you ask how many of my colleagues have cuffs that would be big enough to handle a very large patient, most of them don't. And just that simple thing makes their office unaccessible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's like something I've been learning more and more as time goes on, and um, you know, meeting other fat people and talking about like accessibility stuff. Like it just needs to be more, like you're saying, like the information at least needs to be shared.
Yeah.
That, information should be readily accessible before somebody gets to a park
Yeah.
or wherever they're going, or just like having more accessible things available, like more, like the variety of sizes of cups, or
Yeah.
a recognition, that it's stressful for fat people to go to the doctor. So there might be that playing into a higher reading of the blood pressure.
Yeah.
So there's so many little things like that that you're right. I didn't see either before, the last, I'd say 5 years or so, having more of these conversations. But you don't know what you don't know is the other thing. Like, if
Exactly.
you don't need to know, you generally don't know. And that's something I think we need to have more of those conversations when it comes to fatness, when it comes to disability, when it comes to like race and colonialism and stuff too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where I think it's, the opportunity is there to put it in the education, right? Like at the bare minimum for professionals. I remember at one of the NETIC conferences, I can't remember how many years ago, there was a designer there, and they were talking about this class of like designing and I'm not a sewing, creating what's the word? Anyways, making clothes for people with different shapes than the standard mannequin. And at Ryerson, it is a required base course. Like it's not optional, it is a required course. So that at the very least, the seed has been planted and the conversations have been had. Whether or not someone chooses to pursue that and keep it as part of their value system as they move forward in their practice. And I would love to see that in medicine and in psychology and in like all of our professions, teaching, like wherever we are going to be interacting with the public. Get that in right at the beginning so that that awareness is there. Because, like you said, we don't know what we don't know. And if someone doesn't teach it to us, why would we know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And unless you're faced with actually trying to accommodate somebody, it's only then that you go, oh, I don't know that I have what you need. And then you're trying to retrofit stuff. And so much easier to just have it in mind from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But I think like just to tie in another oppression, like that's such a barrier to all of these things too, is capitalism, right? So it's like the argument would always be made like this isn't financially feasible to do. Like, for example, bigger seats on airplanes, not financially feasible. Um, and then there's that kind of double standard, or like it's mixed. It's a mixed message thing when it comes to clothes. I think is like, when I talk to my friends about clothes, it's like we just want stuff in size fat, and like we would pay money for it. Like we want to pay the same money that anyone else is paying for their clothes, but we will pay for it, type of thing.
Yeah.
So but then there's all the complications around like fast fashion and that kind of like the sustainability of things, and yeah, so it's a complicated conversation, but I feel like no one, or not a lot of people, there are brands definitely that are having those conversations, but they don't want to have it because it's not financially, it doesn't get them more money to, and be more inclusive generally.
Yeah, I wish I could remember that person's name, that speaker. But they actually addressed that exact thing and went through the calculations of creating a size 0 versus a size 24 or something, and it was negligible. It was like a rounding error. It was really not as magnificent as we have been led to believe in that regard, which again I thought was a very cool thing, that that's part of the conversation right at the get-go, because that is the way to just go, well, that doesn't work, it's just going to cost too much money, and it just gets dismissed so quickly.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's just then like it comes into my head then it's like it's the fat phobia. Like
Yep.
they're kind of using maybe this money thing as an excuse when it's really like, well, we don't want to make clothes for that size of body because that size of body shouldn't exist, basically.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And so then that's just the like, it's the justifiable reason. Um, that, yeah, it just costs too much. Well, not entirely. Anyways, we'll challenge those with someone else another day. Um, but any other things? I think you said you had two things coming to mind.
Right.
That was
I
one.
did.
Yeah.
The second thing was about community. So, I talked to people who reclaimed that word fat. And so, we talked about, okay, what was the most useful thing on your journey? And that was overwhelmingly it. Having community, having people that understand, that, get um, anti-diet messages and like want to have those conversations about fat phobia and are supportive of you, like the kinds of friends who will make sure that the restaurant is accessible before you go there, so you don't have to do that work. So that was like really kind of heartwarming, like in contrast to the last thing, dehumanizing. This is now heartwarming, like, okay, like there are people who are thinking this way, or who are doing this kind of work, and people are finding those people, hopefully. And I mean, the people I talked to were anyways. And my hope for people is that they find more people. Like, I think one of the things is people feel so isolated, like we've been talking about, right?
Yeah.
And like more spaces are needed to, bring that community together.
And safe places to ask the questions, and to, because what we're asking people to do is to take the belief systems of an entire culture and question them. We're saying, let's use some critical thinking here, and let's actually stop just accepting these truths that we've been living with our whole lives. And that is intimidating. And so when you have people around you, and the metaphor I always use is that we're learning a new language, right? And everybody around us is still speaking the other language. Like, we were supposed to go on a trip that didn't happen during COVID for a variety of reasons. Anyways, we were using Duolingo to learn how to speak Spanish. And I mean, how do you speak Spanish in a world where everybody else is like, you have to practice it. It's in the conversation. That's where the nuances and the beauty of a language come out, right? And that's hard to do if you don't have people to practice with. And to say, well, like I'm trying to use this word and it's not working. Why? And someone say, oh, it's because, blah, and they explain it and you go, oh, excellent, right? And suddenly you can carry on. And I find so many of the people I work with, they come up against arguments from people and they're like, I have no idea how to share and communicate and defend what it is that I'm doing. And so then they start to backpedal a little bit and they get a little less loud and a little less confident until they come back to community, and whether it's one-on-one or whether it's group work, to then someone says, oh, this is how I address that objection. And that's where that, again, that fluency of this comes out, and it's beautiful and irreplaceable.
Yeah. Well, and I like the language metaphor because, when you start that moment when you're learning a new language, when you start thinking in that language, that's kind of like also that applicable to this, because, so much of this happens in our heads. Yes, there's absolutely like talking to other people and having to sort of justify or explain feeling like you do. And that's really difficult. But there's also that like internalized dialogue that's like, how do you even answer yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And people have forged these trails before us. And yes, ours will be unique, but it's really nice to use the tips and tools of people who have already done this. And one of the things that I was shocked to learn was just how long this movement has been present. Like, people have done a lot of work already that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's been done. So we can learn from it already, which is again, that community is just so important, which is why I love this. And I love that you reached out. And as I get to know more and more people in this space, even as a professional, it is so important for me to have other people to reach out to and go, oh, I'm stuck, I'm triggered, I'm anything. Can you please help me? It's beautiful.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. Like I'm constantly trying to find more people doing this work just to talk to and connect with, and it's invaluable like how much I've gotten from that.
Yeah. Yeah. So you support people who are exiting diet culture. I love the way you said that. It's perfect. And how do you work with people who are in that space that are ready to they're ready to let go and they just need some support in figuring out how to do
Um, do you mean like what would the interventions be, or are you talking more practically?
that? Both.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I work one on one with people.
Okay.
And I do run a group that is for fat folks, like who people who identify as fat. It's called Fat Chat. Um, and so yeah, I mean, interventions wise, it's always so individual, right? Often it does start with just finding out what is their story, like where have they learned what they know or what they believe about bodies, and exploring that together. Talk often it's in childhood, right? We get messages. So exploring that, I think the first step that I often take with people is that like diversify your social media feeds. That's it's such a, I mean, I think because of my like origin story, right? Like it was so impactful for me the
Yeah.
first time I saw that, like, whoa, like mindset shift kind of instantly for me. I think I was primed for it. Like I hated dieting. I always sucked at it, and I was like ready for something else. So I just happened to have that like immediate turnaround, and it's not that fast for everybody, of course.
Right. Yeah.
But like that representation, like we talked about, right? Like seeing somebody who looks like you in a positive light, or who's just even in a neutral way, but to counteract the messages of that we get from TV often of like just negative messaging around fat bodies. Um, so that's definitely like almost always I would say like number one comes up in my first session with people.
Yeah.
No matter what kind of body they're in, I work with people in all sizes of bodies. But usually it's like, what's at the root of this? Fat phobia. Like, let's start normalizing fat.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. And do you have a list of accounts that you start people off with? Do you do it with them or do you send them on their way with a couple hashtags and see where they go?
Yeah, I usually like just tell them to look around themselves. There's so many. Like, I guess in terms of, I do have like a resources page that I give to people sometimes. I would usually, the first number one first person I usually say is Sonia Renee Taylor. So that's like, the body is not an apology, like sending them to that account and website. Um, but like, I kind of like to let people explore on their own. Because for some people, like for example, fashion is really one of the
Yep.
cool things that people like to, that kind of draws them in. For some people, really, it's movement. It's like, seeing people in larger bodies, doing running or hiking or biking or whatever, like, and sharing on socials about that.
Yep.
So yeah, I normally kind of let them just like make the suggestion, and also like saying, find people who look similar to you and who are bigger than you or have a different like identity, like seeking out black folks and people of color and indigenous folks and people with disabilities and like facial differences and like skin pigmentation differences, and like all kinds of things are out there to start to normalize. because yes, like size is a huge part of it, but there's so many differences in bodies that we don't talk about or normalize because it's just one kind of like, perfect skin or whatever. It's like the thing on
Yeah.
TV and movies. Like people don't actually look like that usually.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
some people do, yes, but like just kind of normalizing that we all are different and that's okay.
Mhm. Yeah. I love it. Awesome. Um, what else? What would be another thing that, if people were unable to come and see you, they could, so your fat chats, are they a paid thing? Are they a free thing? How do they work?
Fat Chat is a free social support group for
Awesome.
people who identify as fat or plus size and larger body. You don't have to be using the fat language.
Yeah.
Most people are. I mean, it's called Fat Chat.
Yeah.
And so that has like a Facebook group. So if you sign up for the group, then you can get the link for the meetings that happen on Zoom once a month right now.
Awesome.
Yeah, so
Okay.
that's free.
Beauty. And then they can play with their social media right now. That's an actionable step at the moment to start that diversity, to start seeing more in your feed that isn't
Yeah.
exactly like you or the stereotypical
Yeah.
expectation.
Well, and unfollow anything that makes you feel bad about yourself.
That's so hard for people. They're like, they don't want to unsubscribe from that newsletter because just maybe the next one will be the thing. Letting go of that can be a bit of a grieving process for some people, for sure.
Yes,
Yeah,
it can. I think it's, working on giving yourself the permission to not have to feel bad about yourself. That is a
huge.
really hard thing to do in a society that like profits off of our self-doubt and self-hatred. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
so
World relies on that.
yeah, yeah. And so, I mean, I tend to appeal to people's radical sides.
Okay.
And I'm like, okay, like where's your rebel? Like most people have that inner rebel who's ready to like fuck this, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah. Flip the bird at the whole world.
yeah, so like that's kind of where the rebel can come in of like, okay, well, if this is making me feel bad about myself, like no to that. I'm gonna rebel against that and rebel into self-compassion instead.
I love it. I love it. I named my business the Diet Rebellion, so there you go.
Right.
Yes, I am with you on that. Yeah, amazing. Any other tips you'd like to give our viewers of things they could take away from today and actually go and do?
Yeah, well, like diversify your social media feeds was the first one. Second one is um giving working on giving yourself permission to seek out joy and pleasure.
Pleasure
Like,
seeking, yes.
yeah, like I don't know, I think so many people and especially people in larger bodies feel like we have to be in this perpetual state of like punishment.
Yep.
And so giving ourselves permission to open to the possibility of pleasure or joy is a radical act. It's that rebel part too, right? Of like, no, I'm gonna actually notice what is joyful, what is pleasurable. And like I think a lot of times that sounds kind of like a big thing. Like I have to go out, I don't know, like go to a spa and have a fancy spa day or whatever. But I really look at it as like noticing what's already present for you. So like even if it's like, oh, I really love the color of my walls, or like I really love the sun, how the sun feels on my skin. Like just opening to what is already there. Because we deserve that. Like as humans, that's kind of, I think, our birthright is to be able to experience all of the things, including the pleasurable things, which I think we often don't give ourselves permission to do. We gotta like, I don't know, do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. Just like slow down and notice what's available.
I've been talking to a lot of my female entrepreneur friends about just the hustle, right? And it's that somehow we have to earn the rest, earn the pleasure, earn the joy. And that, again, it's just another cycle of unattainable, unsustainable things. Yeah. So settling in, I often ask patients the very first thing of with the intuitive eating work is, I just want you to notice if you like the food you're eating. That's it. Like, just notice. You don't have to change anything. You don't have to anything. And I remember one woman in particular, and she was like, I love my smoothies. I'm not giving up my smoothies. And I didn't say you had to. I want you to pay attention if you're enjoying that smoothie. And she came back and she's like, I never would have guessed that that's the thing at least like out of what I eat every day. It was this smoothie she had forced herself to eat, to have every morning for decades. And she has brought in different smoothies again, but it took a little while and some, well, what do I even want to eat? Because that's not a consideration when you've been told what to eat your entire life, right?
Yeah, dieting steals that. Like, dieting steals what do I actually like. And one of my favorite examples of that is, like, I always thought I hated yogurt. And for so long, I didn't know that I liked it, because when I tried the full fat yogurt, I was like, wow, this is amazing. Like, dieting stole yogurt from me. And yogurt was one of those things that you always had to eat, right? You'd have your little, like, tiny 0% sad little cup of yogurt. That's at least I did. But then I found full fat yogurt and I was like, wow, this is actually good.
Yeah.
I actually want it.
Cottage cheese was one of those for me. When I actually ate it, I don't tolerate dairy particularly well, so I don't eat it on the regular now, and dairy free is not as good. That satisfaction factor is definitely missing. But yeah, once I had cottage cheese, just like, I was like, it's actually genuinely like this, but it was like this weird breakfast, some weird diet, and I was like, never again.
Right.
It's delicious.
Yeah. I mean, and I hear that about salads a lot. Like, people think that they hate salad, but they begrudgingly eat it. And then when they give up dieting, they're like, oh, I actually love salad. Like, and like, I love chocolate chip cookies. I can love both of those things and have both of those things, and it's fine.
Having veggies with dip. PSA, adding dip does not remove the nutrients from the vegetables, right? Like, it changes the entire experience of eating the vegetable. And it doesn't have to be the hummus or that, like, I like hummus too, but like carrots and hummus, I can't eat them ever again. Like, what about ranch dip? Could I? Yeah. Yes, you can. Go do it. It's exciting. And suddenly vegetables are on the table, or like putting butter back on your vegetables at the dinner table. Like, again, game changer and taste and experience and pleasure. But it's terrifying for people.
Yeah. And one of the books I'm going to mention, because I think she really lays it out very well, is Anti-Diet by Christy Harrison. Like, because she talks about how does dieting steal your money? How does it steal your joy? How does she kind of goes through each thing.
Yeah.
And I think about that so much. Like, it steals so much joy. Like, we get so little joy. I feel like we need to be able to grab it when it's there, And if we have this other thing that's like, no, that can't be joyful. It's like, no.
Yeah.
We don't, like, YOLO, I guess, right?
I know, it's for real though, definitely. Do you have another tip?
My last tip, I kind of talked about a little bit, maybe I touched on this. It's kind of this idea of, like, you are so much more than your body. And like, and that's important, like, by itself, I think. The body does not define you. It doesn't have to define you. Like, we can kind of shrug off these beauty ideals or these ideas about, like, what our body should or shouldn't be. And, like, your body is this vehicle that allows you to be in the world. So I literally would not be here without this body.
Yeah.
And like I like to say, I would not be here without this specific fat body that I have had all of these experiences in, and that like I get to be the person that I am today. And if it wasn't for my fat body, I wouldn't be that person. Like that's for me is transformative. And like for some people, you know, it takes a bit to kind of wrap your head around that, depending on where you're at with your, you know, kind of self-love journey, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
But it's like true, like you're unique and amazing, and like you wouldn't be you without this specific body that you have in all the iterations that it's been through.
Yeah.
Like that's pretty cool.
It's very cool. Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. Yeah. I think starting from that place of gratitude and like, wow, body, thank you. Like you have had my back this whole time. While I did torturously wrong things that were really unkind, you were still here helping me get through my life. And that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and like I do also like to kind of loop in disability stuff around into this conversation because like some people will say, you know, my body is in pain or my body doesn't do the thing that I want it to do, and I want to like honor and recognize that that's a very difficult experience. And like it still is this vehicle that allows you to be here
Yeah.
and has brought you to this point and like, you know, does what you need it to do in terms of surviving on the daily, like breathing,
Yeah.
digesting. Some people have trouble with digesting too, right? But
True.
like your body's trying its hardest, I think. It's you know, our survival mechanism.
I remember when, excuse me, my practice focused a lot on fertility for a lot of years. About 10 years, I worked mostly with fertility. Um, and I ended up doing this work with them anyways because they felt like their body was letting them down. And so it was the same kind of work in a different context. And so a lot of the tools that I use now in this context were developed because my fertility patients were just at war with their bodies. Yeah, they were fighting each other really hard. And it's like, you're on the same team. we, let's rebuild this relationship. And how does one rebuild a relationship? And yeah, you got to stop fighting first and foremost and start listening and being present.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
gratitude goes a very long way.
Yeah, like that war with your body um rhetoric. It's like I think I like to kind of ask, you know, what would it take for you to like put down the weapons, like just kind of meet your body in a different way. Like, and it's hard when you've been doing that for so long. Some people that I've seen have been doing this for like 30, 40 years. And
Yeah.
it's I think that like self-compassion is really key when
Yeah.
it comes to that moment of like, this is going to be really difficult. There's going to be grief and anger and all of those things. And that's okay. That's part of it.
Yeah. Amazing. Amazing. All right. Um, we should probably wrap this up. So I do feel like you and I could talk forever on many of these topics in a million ways. Any final thoughts you'd really like people to have? All right, now stop recording. Where's that button?